Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I moved into this apartment complex about 6 months ago when my landlord sold the building where I had been living for 3 years. What I didn't know was that I'd be sandwiched between two very different neighbors who would make my life interesting in completely opposite ways. On one side lived this sweet older woman who baked cookies every Sunday and always smiled when we passed in the hallway. On the other side lived a guy I started calling Shaggy in my head because of his constant bloodshot eyes and the cloud of herbal smell that followed him everywhere. The contrast between them was almost comical. Shaggy made his presence known on my very first day. I was carrying boxes up the stairs, trying my absolute best to be quiet about it. Sure, there were some unavoidable thuds here and there because furniture is heavy and stairs are narrow, but I was being as careful as humanly possible. Around 7 in the evening, Shaggy threw open his door and glared at me like I had just run over his dog. He started yelling at me about how we have rules in this house and that I needed to keep it down. I apologized and explained I was almost done moving in. He just stood there with his arms crossed, red eyes boring into me, before slamming his door shut. That was my welcome to the building. Things only got worse from there. If I sneezed too loudly, he'd bang on the wall. If I dropped something in my kitchen, I'd hear him stomping around next door, muttering loud enough for me to hear through the walls. And heaven forbid I forgot it was my week to clean the hallways. He'd report me to the landlord before I even realized I'd missed it. The landlord started knowing me by name within the first month, and not in a good way. Every tiny infraction got reported. I played music at a reasonable volume at 8 in the evening, reported. I had friends over for dinner. We laughed a bit too loudly. Reported. I ran my vacuum cleaner at 9 in the morning on a Saturday. You guessed it. Reported. What made it even more frustrating was that my other neighbor didn't care about any of it. I helped her with groceries and household tasks pretty regularly, and during one of our conversations, I mentioned how worried I was about being too noisy. She just laughed and waved me off, telling me not to worry about her at all. She said that long as I didn't bring down the whole building, we were fine. Then she mentioned that she took out her hearing aids every evening at 8 because she liked the quiet. She admitted it was a weird habit, but she seemed happy about it. So I knew for a fact that any complaints about evening noise couldn't be coming from her. It was all Shaggy, every single time. The final straw came one night. I was cooking dinner and accidentally touched the hot stove with my bare hand. The pain was instant and intense, and I let out a string of curses that would make a sailor blush. I was hopping around my kitchen, running cold water over my burned palm, still swearing up a storm. 10 minutes later, someone was pounding on my door. I opened it to find two police officers standing there looking very serious. One of them told me they got a noise complaint about screaming and cursing coming from my apartment. He said they needed to make sure everything was okay and that nobody was hurt. I showed them my burned hand and explained what happened. They seemed skeptical. One of them asked to look around just to be sure. I was annoyed but let them in because I had nothing to hide. They wandered through my tiny apartment, opening closets and checking rooms like they were searching for hidden bodies. I was standing by my window, fuming about the whole situation, when one of the officers joined me there. He looked out at the playground behind our building and then back at me. He asked me if I smoked weed and pointed down at the playground. I was confused by the question until he gestured toward the playground. Then I followed his gaze across the hallway toward Shaggy's door, and suddenly everything clicked into place. Germany had legalized cannabis recently, but there were still restrictions. You couldn't smoke it near playgrounds, schools, or anywhere children gathered. The playground sitting right behind our building meant the entire complex was technically a no-smoking zone for that stuff. And Shaggy? Shaggy was the biggest stoner I'd ever encountered. His eyes were perpetually red. His clothes reeked. His apartment smelled so strong that you could catch a whiff just walking past his door. The guy was high from morning until night, every single day. I never said anything before because I'm not usually the type to snitch on people. What someone does in their own home is their business. But Shaggy had made my life miserable for 6 months straight. He was obsessed with rules and regulations, reporting every minor thing I did wrong. He loved to stand in his doorway and lecture me about how we have rules in this house. Well, the rules applied to him too. I mentioned to the officers that they might want to check on my neighbor. I told them about the constant smell, the red eyes, the fact that he was clearly using despite the playground being right there. They exchanged a look and thanked me for the information. After they finished searching my apartment and found absolutely nothing wrong, they headed across the hallway. I watched through my peephole when they rang Shaggy's bell. When he opened the door, both officers actually took a step backward. Even from across the hall, I could see them reacting to the smell rolling out of his apartment. Their voices were muffled, but I could hear the general tone of the conversation. They asked him about the playground and the children in the building. That's when Shaggy got aggressive. He told them to piss off and that everything was all good nowadays. The officers asked to see his stash. In Germany, you're allowed to have a certain amount, up to 50 grams and 3 plants per adult. Anything more than that is still illegal. Shaggy refused to show them anything. The officers cited probable cause because of the overwhelming smell and his defensive behavior. They told him they needed to check before he could destroy evidence. What happened next was chaos. They pushed past Shaggy into his apartment. I heard yelling, crashing sounds, and then suddenly, Shaggy was screaming at them. There was a loud commotion, something breaking, and then silence. A few minutes later, they brought Shaggy out in handcuffs. One of the officers was sporting a fresh black eye. Shaggy was still trying to argue, still insisting that everything was legal now, that they had no right. But apparently, they'd found way more than the legal limit in his apartment. Way more. When they walked him past my door, I stepped out into the hallway. Shaggy's eyes met mine and I could see the moment he realized what had happened. He shouted at me that I did this and that I was the one who reported him. I just smiled and repeated the words he'd said to me so many times. I told him we have rules in this house. The officers led him away while he was still shouting. My sweet neighbor opened her door, looked at the scene, then at me, and just shook her head with a knowing smile before going back inside. I haven't seen Shaggy since. His apartment has been quiet for 2 weeks now. I can finally sneeze in peace. I stood in the doorway of my daughter's preschool classroom, waiting for dismissal, like I had every day that week. It was only her 5th day of school, but I was already starting to figure out the routine. Parents clustered near the door while the teacher helped each kid gather their things. My daughter came bouncing over with her little backpack and I knelt down to help her get it on. That's when I noticed something was off. I unzipped the bag to check if everything was there. The pull-ups I'd sent were gone, which was fine. The wipes were obviously being used too. But when I looked at the change of clothes I'd packed, only the pants were there. I frowned and looked up, scanning the classroom. That's when I saw it. Another little girl was standing by the cubby area and she was wearing my daughter's shirt, the one I'd sent in her bag just that morning. It was distinctive, a purple top with butterflies on it that I'd gotten on clearance a few months back. There was no mistaking it. My first instinct was to walk over there and say something, but I stopped myself. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe my daughter had an accident and they'd given her shirt to the other kid by mistake. I decided to wait and talk to the teacher privately. When we walked to the car, I asked my daughter about her day. She told me they played blocks and she had crackers for snack. I asked if she'd had any accidents today or needed to change her clothes. She said nope, she'd stayed dry all day. That confirmed it. She hadn't needed the change of clothes at all. So why was another kid wearing her shirt? I spent the rest of the evening thinking about it. Look, I'm not heartless. I get that some parents are struggling. I've been there. There have been times when I've had to choose between buying groceries or buying my daughter new clothes, and the groceries won. I know what it's like to send your kid to school hoping nobody notices they're wearing the same outfit 3 days in a row. That's why I don't mind sharing the pull-ups. If another kid needs one and the teacher grabs one from my daughter's stash, that's totally fine. Same with the wipes. I'd even send extra if the teacher asked me to. Those things are supplies, and I understand that not every parent can afford to send them. But clothes are different. My daughter doesn't have a huge wardrobe. I buy most of her stuff secondhand or on clearance, and I stretch every dollar far enough. That purple butterfly shirt cost me $4, which might not sound like much, but when you're counting every penny, $4 is $4. And now it was on someone else's kid. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I got. What if that family doesn't send it back? What if it gets lost or ruined? I can't just run out and replace it. And what message does it send if I don't say anything? That it's okay to just take my daughter's things and give them to other kids? By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed to talk to the teacher. I got to school a few minutes early and waited until most of the other parents had dropped off their kids. The teacher was organizing some papers at her desk when I approached. I asked if she had a minute because I wanted to talk to her about something. She said of course and asked what was up. I explained that yesterday when I'd picked up my daughter, I'd noticed that the shirt from her change of clothes was missing. I'd seen it on another student. The teacher's face did this thing where she tried to look sympathetic but also a little defensive. She told me that, yes, one of the other students had an accident and didn't have a change of clothes, so she'd used my daughter's shirt. She hoped that was okay. I said that actually that was what I wanted to talk to her about. I didn't mind sharing pull-ups or wipes at all. I was happy to send extra of those things if she needed me to, but I wasn't comfortable with my daughter's clothes being given to other children. She pointed out that they had to make sure all the children were taken care of. They couldn't have a child sitting in soiled clothes all day. I told her I completely understood that and I wasn't saying she should. But my daughter didn't have a lot of clothes and I couldn't afford to replace them if they didn't get sent back. Clothes were expensive. The teacher mentioned that parents were supposed to return borrowed items. I asked what happened if they didn't, or what if they forgot. Then I'd be out a shirt that I needed for my own daughter. I'd send those clothes for her, not for a lending library for the whole class. The teacher crossed her arms. She asked if I was saying I wouldn't help other children who needed it. I felt my face get hot. She was trying to make me feel guilty, like I was being selfish. I told her that wasn't what I was saying at all. I'd already told her I'd send extra pull-ups and wipes. But my daughter's personal clothing needed to stay hers. If there was a child who consistently didn't have changes of clothes, maybe she should talk to their parents or see if the school had an assistance program. She said she didn't think I understood how hard some of these families had it. I said, actually, I did understand. I've been that parent. But that didn't mean I should have to sacrifice my own daughter's clothes. I was barely making it work myself. We stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, she sighed. She said fine. She wouldn't use my daughter's clothes for other students anymore. I thanked her and told her I really did mean it about sending extra supplies. She should just let me know what she needed. I left feeling both relieved and annoyed. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was just trying to protect what little we had. When I picked up my daughter that afternoon, I made sure to check her bag. The purple butterfly shirt was back, folded neatly inside. I was just trying to get through my shift at the grocery store without any drama. My manager had called in sick that morning, which meant I was stuck handling everything on my own until the evening crew showed up. The store was relatively quiet for an afternoon, just a few customers wandering the aisles, when I heard the first crash. The sound came from the dairy section. I grabbed my walkie and headed toward the back of the store, already dreading what I might find. When I rounded the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. A woman was standing in front of one of the display fridges, systematically yanking out milk cartons, yogurt containers, and cheese packages, and hurling them onto the floor. The tiles were already covered in a spreading puddle of milk and broken glass from shattered bottles. I told her she needed to stop that right now. She didn't even look at me, just kept throwing things. A gallon of orange juice exploded on impact, sending sticky liquid everywhere. I said it again, more firmly this time, telling her she was destroying store property. That's when she finally turned to face me. Her eyes were wild, almost manic. She said she wasn't stopping until we gave her what she deserved. I asked her what she needed, saying maybe I could help her find something. She said free groceries. She told me she was a single mother and asked if I knew how hard it was. She said she shouldn't have to pay for any of this. I blinked at her, certain I'd misheard. I told her I was sorry, but we couldn't just give her free groceries. That wasn't how it worked. She insisted we could, that we just didn't want to. She said we never wanted to help anyone. She grabbed the last few items from the fridge and threw them over her shoulder without even looking. Then, before I could process what was happening, she climbed inside the now empty display fridge and sat down, crossing her arms. She announced she wasn't coming out until we gave her everything she wanted. Free groceries. Special treatment. She said she deserved it. I stood there with my mouth hanging open. In 5 years of retail work, I'd seen plenty of ridiculous behavior, but this was a new level entirely. I told her she couldn't sit in there, that it was a health code violation, and asked her to please come out. She refused. I warned her that I was going to have to call the police if she didn't come out right now. She told me to call them. She said she didn't care and wasn't moving until she got what she deserved. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher sounded skeptical when I explained the situation, but she promised to send officers right away. While I waited, other customers started gathering at the end of the aisle, phones out, recording the whole scene. The woman just sat there in the fridge, glaring at everyone, occasionally shouting about how unfair everything was and how single mothers were treated like garbage by society. I suggested that if she'd just come out, we could talk about this like reasonable people. She said there was nothing to talk about. She claimed she knew her rights, that she was a customer, and we had to give her special treatment. She insisted that was the law. I told her that was definitely not the law. She insisted it was, saying she'd looked it up online. I didn't bother arguing. The police would be here soon enough, and this would become their problem instead of mine. 15 minutes later, 2 officers walked into the store. I met them near the entrance and explained the situation as quickly as I could. One of them, a younger guy with dark hair, looked like he was trying not to laugh. The other, an older woman with graying hair, just sighed heavily. The male officer guessed she was demanding free stuff. I confirmed that, adding she was also refusing to leave the fridge. The female officer said, of course she was. We walked back to the dairy section together. The woman was still sitting in the fridge, now shivering slightly from the cold, but too stubborn to admit defeat. The male officer told her she needed to exit the refrigerator unit immediately. She refused, saying not until they gave her what she deserved. The female officer said that wasn't going to happen and told her to come out now or they'd remove her by force. The woman claimed they couldn't touch her, that it would be assault. The male officer stepped forward and reached into the fridge, grabbing her arm. She jerked away from him, and before anyone could react, she lunged forward and bit down hard on his hand. The officer screamed and tried to pull away, but her teeth were clamped down like a vice. Blood started seeping between her lips. The female officer yelled at her to let go, repeating it urgently. But she wouldn't. Her jaw was locked, and I could see the panic in the male officer's eyes when he realized she wasn't letting up. His partner moved fast, positioning herself behind the woman and applying some kind of pressure point technique to her jaw. Within seconds, the woman's mouth popped open, releasing the officer's hand. Both officers moved quickly then, pulling her out of the fridge and forcing her face down on the floor while they cuffed her. She was screaming the whole time about police brutality and her rights being violated. The injured officer was clutching his hand, blood dripping steadily onto the already ruined floor. His finger was mangled, deep tooth marks visible in the flesh, but thankfully still attached. The female officer called for an ambulance while keeping her knee firmly planted on the woman's back. The woman kept screaming that this was discrimination, that she was a single mother and they couldn't treat her like this. The female officer told her she'd just assaulted a police officer and was looking at serious charges. I asked if he was going to be okay. The female officer said he'd need stitches, maybe surgery. She said the woman had nearly bitten his finger clean off. An ambulance arrived about 10 minutes later. Paramedics bandaged the officer's hand and loaded him up. His partner stayed behind to finish processing the arrest. When they hauled the woman out in handcuffs, still screaming about injustice and single mothers deserving better treatment, I noticed all the customers with their phones still recording. This was definitely going viral. The female officer turned to me before leaving and told me I'd need to file a formal report about the property damage. She explained they'd be pressing multiple charges, including assault on an officer, destruction of property, and trespassing. I said I would. I spent the next 3 hours cleaning up the mess, mopping up milk and juice, sweeping up broken glass, documenting everything for the insurance claim. My manager called around 6 to check in, and when I told him what happened, he actually laughed. The story made local news that night. Turns out the officer needed 12 stitches and would be on medical leave for weeks. The woman was charged with felony assault, destruction of property, and resisting arrest. Her bail was set at $10,000. I deleted my social media apps for a week after the incident went viral. Customers kept coming in asking if I was the employee from the video, wanting to take selfies, treating the whole thing like some kind of tourist attraction. The fridge had to be completely replaced due to health code violations. Cost the store nearly $4,000. Turns out the police report mentioned she had multiple prior incidents of this type of behavior at other stores. Just never escalated to violence before. I met my husband when I was 23. We were both at a friend's wedding, sitting at the same table during dinner. He spilled champagne on my dress while trying to make a dramatic toast, and instead of being mortified, he just laughed and said he'd buy me a new one if I gave him a chance to make it up to me over coffee. I said yes. We got married 2 years later. Small ceremony, just close friends and family. Everything felt right. We talked about kids, about growing old together, about all the boring, wonderful things couples dream about when they think they have all the time in the world. Then he got sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months. He lasted 8, fighting the whole way. When he died, I was 26. Too young to be a widow, everyone said, as if there's an acceptable age for it. After the funeral, I moved most of his things into storage. I couldn't bear to get rid of them, but I also couldn't stand seeing them every day. His clothes, his books, the guitar he never quite learned to play. All of it went into boxes, but I kept one thing. His favorite hoodie. Navy blue, worn soft from years of use, with a faded logo from some band he loved in college. It was huge on me, the sleeves hanging past my fingertips, the hem falling almost to my knees. I wore it constantly during those first awful months. It still smelled like him, like his cologne and something else, something that was just him. I'd wrap myself in it and pretend just for a moment that I wasn't alone. 2 years passed. The grief got quieter but never really left. I learned to function again, to go through the motions of normal life, but I still wore that hoodie around the house. Still buried my face in the collar sometimes when things got hard. Last week I drove to my parents' house for the weekend. They'd been asking me to visit for months, and I finally gave in. I packed a bag, left the hoodie at home since I'd only be gone a couple days, and made the 3-hour drive. Everything seemed fine at first. My mom made my favorite dinner. My dad asked about work. We watched a movie together like we used to. Normal family stuff. Then, on Saturday afternoon, my 15-year-old cousin showed up. My aunt had dropped her off to hang out while she ran errands. She came bouncing into the living room wearing an oversized navy blue hoodie that made my heart stop. I knew that hoodie. I knew every pulled thread, every faded spot, every detail. I asked her where she got it. She told me my mom had given it to her last month, said it was really comfortable. Then she added that my mom had mentioned I'd moved on and didn't need it anymore. The room tilted. I looked at my mother, who was suddenly very interested in her phone. My cousin looked between us, clearly sensing she'd walked into something. She asked nervously if she'd said something wrong. I told her no, she hadn't done anything wrong. Then I asked my mother if we could talk in the kitchen. My mother sighed like I was being dramatic and followed me. My dad took my cousin outside to look at something in the garden, giving us space. I told my mother that was my husband's hoodie and she had no right to take it. She said it was just a hoodie, that I was young and would find love again, that I couldn't hold on to the past forever. I asked her how she even got it. That wasn't her decision to make. It was mine. It was his. She reminded me she had a key to my apartment, said she'd stopped by last month to drop off some dishes I'd left at their house during Christmas. She saw the hoodie hanging on my bedroom door and thought I'd finally be ready to let go of some things. My cousin needed new clothes for school and she thought it would be perfect. I told her she thought wrong, that she'd gone through my things without permission, that she'd taken something that belonged to my husband, something I kept because it mattered to me. She said I needed to move forward, that clinging to an old piece of clothing wasn't healthy. She was trying to help. I asked her how stealing from me was helping. I told her she'd decided what I should feel and when I should feel it, and she'd taken something precious to me without asking. She said I was being dramatic, that she was my mother and knew what was best for me. I didn't trust myself to say anything else. I walked upstairs to the guest room and started packing my bag. My hands were shaking. My mom followed, standing in the doorway. She asked if I was really leaving over this. I didn't answer, just kept folding clothes and shoving them into my bag. She said, "Fine, run away." That's what I always did when things got difficult. I zipped my bag and walked past her. My cousin was back inside looking miserable. She'd clearly figured out what was happening. She said she didn't know and she was so sorry. Started pulling the hoodie off and told me to take it back. I held up a hand and told her to keep it for now. This wasn't her fault. She didn't do anything wrong. She said, but it was mine, it was my husband's. She didn't want to keep it. I told her I knew and I appreciated that. But I needed to leave right then and I didn't want her to feel bad about something my mother did. I'd get it from her later. She nodded, tears in her eyes. Sweet kid. Not her fault she got caught in the middle of this. My dad walked me to my car. He said my mother meant well. I asked him if she really did. Or did she decide she knew better than me about my own grief, about my own life? He didn't have an answer for that. I drove home. 2 days later, my cousin's mom dropped off the hoodie with a long apology about how she had no idea what her sister had done. I thanked her and assured her it wasn't her fault either. I haven't spoken to my mother since. She sent a text yesterday, just a single eye roll emoji because I didn't call her for Mother's Day. I deleted it and put the hoodie back where it belongs, hanging on my bedroom door, still smelling faintly of cologne and comfort and everything I lost. My father called this morning asking me to forgive her, said she is hurt that I'm shutting her out. I told him she can be hurt. She hurt me first, and unlike her, I didn't go digging through her private things to do it. I joined the rowing club during my first semester because I needed something to do after classes and figured it might be a good way to meet people. I had zero experience with rowing, but they needed coxswains and I was light enough to qualify. For those who don't know, the coxswain is the person who sits in the boat and steers while yelling at everyone else to row harder. You don't actually row yourself. The club was massive. Since it wasn't a competitive varsity sport with tryouts, pretty much anyone could join. We had enough people to fill multiple boats for both the men's and women's teams at different skill levels. I counted once and realized we had over 50 people showing up to practice regularly. Right away, I noticed something. Out of all those people, only 2 of us were black, me and 1 girl on the varsity women's team. We didn't really talk much at first since we were on different squads. But eventually we ended up chatting after a practice one day. She told me something that really put things in perspective. She said I was her first black friend on campus in 3 years. 3 years? That hit me harder than I expected. Most of the guys on my team came from farming communities or small towns. Nice enough people, but not exactly what you'd call culturally aware. The locker room talk was what you'd expect from a bunch of college guys who spent hours together in tight spaces. Lots of dumb jokes, lots of rough housing, lots of the usual nonsense. I could handle that. I grew up with brothers and played sports in high school. None of that bothered me. But I also knew I was in a unique position. Being the only black guy meant I needed to establish boundaries early. I couldn't let things slide that might seem minor to everyone else but would set a bad precedent. So I laughed at the harmless stuff and participated in the team culture, but I stayed alert. I made it clear from the start that I could take a joke but that there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. Most of the guys seemed to get it. They catch themselves sometimes and correct course, which I appreciated. One of the running jokes on the team was about coxswains. Since we didn't physically row, the rowers loved to tease us about not doing real work. They'd say we didn't deserve the same respect as the people actually pulling the oars. Some guys joked that coxswains didn't deserve rights at all. It was stupid athlete humor, the kind of thing where everyone knows it's not serious. Even I made jokes about it sometimes. We'd play along and act offended, then fire back with our own jokes about how rowers were too dumb to steer themselves. This went on for a few months into the full season. We'd finish practice, hit the showers, and stand around talking while we changed. The coxswains usually hung out together since we dealt with similar experiences and frustrations. We'd complain about the rowers who didn't listen to our calls or the boats that were harder to steer. We'd share tips on voice projection and race strategies. It was a good group for the most part. One evening after a long practice, we were all chatting in the locker room. There were maybe 6 or 7 of us coxswains there, all unwinding and joking around. Practice had run late, past 6:30 in the evening, and we were all tired and hungry. Someone brought up the usual coxswain jokes and we were riffing on them, playing along with a bit about how we supposedly didn't contribute anything real to the team. We were laughing about how the rowers acted like we were just dead weight they had to carry around. Then one of the other coxswains, this white guy I've been friendly with all season, decided to add his own twist to the joke. He said that coxswains were only 3/5 of a person. Everyone else in the group laughed. They were all white and clearly didn't catch the reference or didn't think about it. But I stopped dead in the middle of what I was doing. I turned to look at him and asked him what he just said. The laughter died down. He looked uncomfortable, like he was starting to realize he might have messed up but wasn't sure how. He repeated himself, saying again that coxswains were only 3/5 of a person. I didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there staring at him while everyone else got quiet. The whole room felt tense suddenly. You could tell they knew something was wrong, but most of them probably couldn't figure out what. A couple of guys looked between me and him, trying to piece it together. Then I grabbed my bag and started heading for the door. I announced loudly that I was done for the night and wasn't dealing with this anymore. I said I'd see them later, but maybe not. My voice was sharp and final. I didn't wait for a response, didn't look back at their faces. But the locker room had mirrors on one wall, and I could see everyone's reflection when I walked out. They all looked incredibly uncomfortable. Some looked confused. A few looked like they'd just figured out what the problem was and were horrified. That guy who made the joke looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Good. That was exactly the reaction I wanted. I wanted them to sit with that discomfort for a while. I wanted them to think about what had just happened and why I'd reacted that way. I made it about halfway across the parking lot before I heard footsteps running up behind me. It was him. The guy who made the joke. He called out for me to wait and immediately launched into an apology. He said he was really sorry about what he'd said back there and that he wasn't thinking about how that sounded. He admitted it was completely out of line. I stopped and turned to face him. He looked genuinely upset with himself, not just worried about getting in trouble. There's a difference, and you can usually tell. I asked him if he even knew what he was referencing. He said yes, that it was the 3/5 compromise from when they were counting enslaved people for representation. He swore he didn't make that connection when he said it. He explained he was just trying to make a dumb math joke about coxswains not being full team members. But he said that saying it out loud to me made him realize how messed up that was. He apologized again. I studied his face for a minute. He seemed sincere. I told him I appreciated the apology, but that he needed to think before he talked. I pointed out that he was in a group where everyone was white except one person, and that mattered. I explained that jokes like that don't exist in a vacuum and that he needed to be aware of the history behind the words he was using. He agreed with me completely. He said I was right and promised it wouldn't happen again. He also said he was going to talk to the other guys about it so they understood why I'd left. And to his credit, it didn't happen again. He was more careful after that and actually called out a couple other guys when they crossed lines later in the season. One time, during practice, a rower made a comment about something being ghetto and he shut it down immediately. Told the guy that wasn't cool and to watch his language. I didn't become best friends with him or anything, but he earned my respect that night by owning his mistake. The next practice was a little awkward at first, A few of the guys who'd been in the locker room came up to me separately and apologized. They said they hadn't understood the reference in the moment, but felt terrible once they realized. I appreciated that they took the time to say something. One guy even said he'd gone home and looked it up because he wanted to understand exactly what had happened. The team dynamic shifted a bit after that. People were more careful with their words around me, but not in a walking on eggshells kind of way. More like they were actually thinking about what they were saying before they said it. There was still other nonsense I had to deal with that year from different team members. Some guys who weren't in the locker room that day and didn't get the memo. But at least after that incident, people were more aware that I wasn't going to tolerate everything just to fit in. That moment in the locker room became a turning point for how the team interacted with me. They knew where the line was now, and most of them were smart enough not to cross it again. The ones who did cross it found themselves getting called out not just by me, but by other teammates who'd learned something from what happened. By the end of the season, things felt different, better. We won a few races and the team felt more unified. I even convinced a couple of the guys to come to a campus event about diversity and inclusion. They didn't have to go, but they showed up anyway. That meant something to me. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.